Fly this helicopter and I'll marry you, she joked. Then she tossed the keys. They skittered across the marble like a dare. Phones rose. A dozen cameras caught the arc. Laughter ricocheted under the cathedral ceiling of the SkyCorp atrium. Victoria Blackwood stood at the center of it, heels planted, smile thin and practiced. Her voice carried like glass in a room used to listening for power. Marcus Thompson bent instinctively, fingertips brushing the cold metal as the keys came to rest beneath the ornate fountain. For a moment, everything narrowed to the weight of those keys and the heat of 1,000 eyes. He was a janitor. Tonight, his uniform smelled faintly of bleach and late-shift coffee, while the executives wore cut suits and the perfume that seemed to belong to a different planet. He could have left them where they lay. He could have swallowed the humiliation. Instead, he met Victoria's eyes. She laughed then, the laugh of someone sure of the world and of their place in it. "Come on, Marcus. Don't tell me you can't even get it started," she said, playfully cruel. "You used to fly, didn't you? Isn't that right? Fly this helicopter and I'll marry you." The room laughed with her. Phones clicked. Someone waved a small flag of mock sympathy. Marcus felt the old knot return, not the one in his knees, the one beneath the ribs that had been waiting since Afghanistan, always ready to tighten. He smiled a small, automatic smile and handed the keys back. The motion was practiced, polite, the gesture of a man trained to obey. Later, in the dim corridor, his supervisor would call it a breach of decorum. The board would file it under public relations incident. Victoria's veil of charm would survive another day. But in the way the keys had slid across the stone, the way cameras had hunched forward as if to catch a spectacle, Marcus felt something else. The same cheap thrill he'd seen before when someone with money had decided to make sport of someone without it. And something in him, call it stubbornness or the last ember of a soldier's pride, made him tuck a small memento into his pocket, not to reclaim dignity, but because he recognized the moment for what it was, an invitation to forget who people really are. Stay for the full story. This one gets stranger. 6 months earlier, the company had been a different kind of stage. Robert Blackwood's portrait still hung in the executive hallway, a stiff-lipped founder with a reputation for starters and breakers. He had built Skycraft Tech from a grit and vision garage into a $2 billion aerospace concern. When he died, the inheritance split the air like an incoming rotor wash. Victoria, his only child, inherited the crown. The boardroom learned new habits faster than the custodial staff learned new routes. Marcus's shift began at midnight. The building breathed at night, fluorescent hums, the low thrum of HVAC, the occasional clack of a security guard's boots.
He had been on nights for years, a figure known to the same alleys and stairwells as the nocturnal pigeons. He moved through the place like someone tracing the seams of an old map. Trash collected, bathrooms cleaned, a forgotten file box tucked under a conference table dusted off. The job paid enough for a small apartment, 3 hot meals, and a rhythm that kept him from falling into the long dark of the day. Marcus had been a Chief Warrant Officer 3 with the 160th SOAR, Night Stalkers. He'd flown in places where the night had teeth and the sky had lieutenants. He was not, in the way people sometimes imagined, a man on a pedestal or a parade. He was a man who'd seen what stubbornness cost and carried it home under his clothes in the form of tremors and dreams that replayed like film spliced wrong. PTSD didn't make him soft. It made him exacting about quiet details and allergic to public spectacle. He took his meds, went to therapy when he could, and kept a counselor's number in his phone next to the number of his old commander. He knew his triggers, and he kept them small, until the day they couldn't be kept on a leash. On the nights when the atrium turned to dusk and the offices dimmed, Marcus did the rounds. He kept an eye on the maintenance archives. Habits from the military never left him entirely. Little things caught his attention. A maintenance ledger left open when it shouldn't have been, a spray bottle cap that didn't match the rest, a set of keys returned to the wrong hook. He did not look like a man who noticed paperwork, but he did. That was the thing people underestimated about him. He saw what others dismissed as background. The first puzzle arrived in the form of a log entry, a sheet tucked into a binder in the back of the mechanical room. Marcus found it while scraping gum from a stairwell railing, an extra entry, hastily scrawled, with hours that didn't add up. To anyone else it would read like a footnote. To Marcus it read like a question. He began to make a list on the inside of his head. Dates, discrepancies, odd smells at the rooftop hangar. There were other clues, a red-tinted fluid on a rag in the hangar trash, a vendor's receipt that had been filed under the wrong month, a phone call Marcus overheard one night in the parking garage, a voice trembling mentioning payments and insurance. The voice belonged to David Sterling, Skycraft Tech CFO, a man whose thin hands trembled when he signed expense reports, a man who lived in a world of spreadsheets and the soft panic of debt. People who make their living balancing numbers rarely disclose the weight behind them. When they crack in quiet, inefficient ways. Sarah Mitchell in HR was the one voice who softened the edges of the board for the lower ranks. She was the kind of administrative professional who had learned to carry heavy things, personnel files, a conscience, and lately, secrets. She'd worked closely with Robert for years. When he insisted on leaving instructions in the event of anything, he trusted Sarah to hide them where the board would be least likely to look. In an era of digital transparency, Robert had asked for a paper will, tucked in a folder stamped with his initials. Sarah kept it. She kept more than that. She kept a set of photocopies of certain insurance policies, the kind that read differently in small print. Marcus turned these fragments into a kind of geometry. The math of it didn't require expertise in aircraft systems. It required a mind conditioned to see patterns, to assemble cause from poor odds. He watched David at drinks hour, the man's hands tracing the stem of a glass like he was trying to hold himself together. He watched Victoria ascend like a monarch learning how to wield a scepter. He watched security cameras cycle, and he watched the way the board treated the cleaning staff like a separate class. Once, months before the keys on the marble, Marcus found David's name on a list of potential payees meant to trigger a clause in an obscure insurance policy if a principal suffered catastrophic loss. It would take a conspiracy-hardened mind to stitch together what that list meant. To Marcus, it was more arithmetic than malice. If a principal died, the policy kicked in. If that principal died at the wrong time, money could move in the right pockets. The idea lodged like a splinter. He couldn't unsee it. He started to ask small questions. To the security guard who drank stale coffee by the loading dock, "Do you remember who was on the roof last night?" To Sarah in HR, "Are there any new clauses in the insurance since Robert's passing?" Her eyes would flick, a tiny confession of the burden she carried. She'd been Robert's confidant. Robert had trusted her to keep things simple on the outside while building contingencies on the inside. She told Marcus, one night when he emptied a trash can near her desk, that Robert had kept a folder that made her uneasy. He didn't want anyone reading it, but he wanted it safe, she said. He told me, "If anything happens to me, someone might need to know why I put Marcus on the payroll." She didn't say more, but her voice thinned in a way that made Marcus sit back on his heels and listen. The pieces were not on their own, a plot, a maintenance record here, a policy footnote there, a trembling CFO. But in the space where them met, in the way a spider's web seems unremarkable until something big hits it, Marcus saw a possibility no one else wanted to voice. Part of the problem was that no one listened to janitors. People mistook his stillness for passivity. They assumed the brown uniform was a life choice and not a survivor's shelter. That misreading gave Marcus both cover and a kind of moral loneliness. He could walk the halls and no one would suspect he was counting more than dust motes. It also meant he could get closer to things without setting off alarms.
The company's culture was a mechanism as efficient as any machine. The higher you sat, the more sure you were of the loyalty around you. People with power made jokes about those below them. Jokes hardened into policy. The system had its own hydraulic of privilege, and it rarely leaked. David's debt was not rumor. Marcus learned through a careless teller in a break room that Sterling had taken out personal loans with sketchy guarantors, names that came up in late-night whispers in the wrong bars. The Torino family was one of those murmurs, a family with muscle and a ledger of favors. They did not wear their badges on lapels. They wore them in the way men glance away from a debt they cannot pay. The ledger on David's life had a red line he couldn't cross, and the city has a way of collecting interest with hands that are not polite. Marcus's past made him good at patient observation. He could read subtle shifting like a pilot senses wind changes. If something in a fuselage was amiss, the flow changed. Similarly, if a corporate machine had been greased for a specific fault, the cadence of its servants changed. People who are about to do a wrong thing walk like people carrying heat. They speak quietly, paying for silence with thrift. One night, while pushing a mop bucket down an emergency exit corridor, Marcus overheard the tale of a voicemail David had left himself, the kind CFOs leave, reminders, to-dos, numbers, but this one held a word that froze his hand on the mop handle. Payment. Tonight. Final. He could hear a shallow, claustrophobic panic in the static. Marcus did not have proof. He had an intuition the size of a husk. He started to record those intuitions on paper, in a notebook hidden in his locker. Dates, patrols, a note like a surgeon's shorthand. red fluid on rag 318, maintenance ledger hours off 320, Sterling call 322. Sarah, after a month of polite detachment, slid a folder into Marcus's hands. They were alone by the coffee machine. The building smelled like burnt grounds and lemon-scented sanitizer. Robert made me promise to bring these to someone who'd listen, she said. She looked at Marcus as if weighing whether his silence came from fear or strategy. He said, Marcus sees what others don't. I think he was right. The folder held copy copies, an insurance addendum, an unsigned note from Robert that read like a directive to protect a certain employee in case of malicious business strategies, and tucked at the bottom, a curiosity Marcus did not understand immediately, a document indicating a contingent payout triggered by what the legal team called an unforeseen accident. You shouldn't have these, Marcus whispered. You shouldn't have to have them, Sarah answered. The discovery made the building closer at night. Marcus's body reminded him of basic survival, stretchers, seatbelts, the smell of jet fuel and dust in his mouth. He walked the rooftop once, alone, looking over the edge at the city lights.
He thought of the keys on the atrium floor, of Victoria's laugh. He thought of the men in Iraq who had laughed before an ambush, and how laughter tastes different when someone else's life is at stake. Marcus did what veterans often do in the face of ambiguity. He prepared for contingencies, not out of bravado, but because there was a person who might be walking into a hazard and no one else seemed willing to assume responsibility. He told no one about the folder. He carried it in the crease of his sock when he left for work, because the thought of leaving it in his locker felt like depositing evidence in an unguarded place. He learned to move between the night cruise and the day world with the furtive grace of someone who had lived half a life in the margins. When he confronted David, it was in the way one confronts a wound, with care, not accusation. Marcus found him in a conference room at 3 a.m, a single desk lamp making a pool of light across David's printed spreadsheets. The CFO looked up like a man who had been branded. "Do you know what this is?" Marcus asked, placing the photocopy of the insurance clause on the table between them. David's hand found the edge of the paper like seeking a life preserver. He ran a stiff thumb across the column of text, eyes suddenly far away. "You shouldn't be looking at that," he said. He was not surprised to see Marcus. He was only surprised that a man with a broom had found the same paper he had been trying to hide. "There's a payout here," Marcus said simply. "Someone gets money if something happens." David swallowed. His mouth made a sorry shape. "It's more complicated," he said. "There's debt, there's—" He stopped, fighting for the phrasing. He had not expected Marcus to ask him for confessions like a priest. "There's pressure," David finished. "Things I thought I could manage. I made choices." "Who's pressing?" Marcus asked. David's fingers trembled in daylight now. "People. Names I don't say. They don't care what happens to the company. They care about the ledger. I thought I could buy time. I thought the policy would be the thing that saves us." He laughed then, but there was nothing funny in it. "I'm not a killer, Marcus, I swear. I'm a man who miscounted." Marcus looked at him for a long time. The moral geometry of it was ugly. Someone in a corner, someone with an option that could be weaponized, someone with debt and threats and a ledger that pushed him toward an impossible choice. He thought about the men he'd flown with, about decisions made on instinct and the thin margin between life and death. He thought about the keys in the atrium, tossed like a coin in a gladiator pit. "You have to stop whatever you're thinking of doing," Marcus said finally. It was not an order. It was not even a plea. It was a line drawn in the dark. David's shoulders slumped as if someone had finally allowed him to bend. "I can't. Not without them finding out."
A week later, the anonymous calls began. At first they were simple, crackling silence, followed by a single word. "Remember." The line would go dead. Then came the more pointed ones, a voice with the cadence of someone used to intimidation, telling him the building had ears for everyone and that the past had a way of sinking. They left messages about company security footage being lost if files were misplaced. The effect was a small bell of dread that kept Marcus awake. He had been trained to read the body language of threats. They are rarely loud. They are often mundane. The calls were mundane. That was the point. Marcus told Colonel Morrison about them. Colonel Morrison had commanded him years ago and had a habit of showing up in people's lives like a weathered umbrella. The colonel didn't take orders from corporate boards. He took care of old soldiers. "You don't have to face it alone," he said when Marcus told him about the phone calls in the folder. He didn't say the thing Marcus feared most, that his past made him a target.
He didn't need to. The colonel's silence said it. The threats escalated in small, careful ways. Someone slashed a tire on Marcus's old sedan one night, not a violent act, but an unmistakable mark of warning. Someone left a photograph of his barracks in his locker with a phrase scrawled across it. It was petty, and it was personal, the kind of message meant to be decoded by the one who had a map to every hurt. Marcus could have gone to the police. He could have handed everything to HR and let them manage the mess. Instead, he did something that made some veterans uneasy. He decided to act from within the margins. Not to sabotage, not to vigilante. He did what he could to thread a needle, protect an innocent life, and gather evidence. That distinction mattered to him. It mattered because he had seen what happens when you become the law in your hands, good intention blurring into revenge. He began to plan. The plan was not cinematic in the way people think of movie plots. It was a list of small moral adjustments, ensuring that if a mechanical failure occurred, someone could respond, leaving a breadcrumb for a terrified pilot to follow that would not teach sabotage, but would teach survival. Recording David's confessions in places the right ears could find. Marcus knew how to be invisible in a room and how to make sure a truth could not be buried under corporate gloss. He also knew the cost. If he were discovered, the board would call him a liability. Victoria would call him a rogue employee. The Torrin family, Torino, the mob enforcers, names he'd heard whispered in the payroll office, would call it a betrayal. Marcus was not naive. He understood that the law might be on his side eventually, but law is slow and menace is immediate. He felt the old military calculus tick. Accept risk, control variables, hope the collateral damage was minimized.
On the night he decided to act, he stood on the roof again and looked at the helicopter, a dormant bird wrapped in tarps and wires. It was a machine of the company and a symbol of Victoria's ascent. Marcus thought of her toast that night in the atrium, of the keys sliding like a gauntlet. He thought of the way the company made jokes into policy and policy into a means of erasure. He thought of Sarah's folder in his sock and David's haunted eyes. He thought of the men who would feel better if someone with the right name died. He did not think of himself as a savior. There was nothing theatrical about what he planned. He planned for survivability. He planned to ensure that if something went wrong, the pilot would have a chance. He planned also to make sure that any confession and any paper trail David had left would surface in a way that federal agents would not miss. That was the moral formulation: protect the living, expose the guilty. But planning was theory. Execution would be different. Marcus had to move through the building like a shadow, slipping past security sweeps, bypassing the gaze of cameras. He knew the schedule of the cleaning crews and the timing of the night guard cigarettes. He had to choose the hole through which he would thread his actions, one that left no clear signature back to him. In a world where janitorial staff are screens for the invisible, he could use that invisibility as cover for honesty. He began to record more intentionally, using a battered voice recorder a friend had given him years ago. He had it because sometimes truth needs the fidelity of a device. He recorded his conversations, the shouted phone calls he could catch through the paper-thin walls, the crackled conversation of a nervous man who thought no one was listening. He kept his meditation notes, his therapy appointment times, the colonel's number, and Sarah's whispered directions all in the same seam, because to keep them compartmentalized was to risk losing them. The clock that tracked Victoria's flight time moved on. Meetings were scheduled, announcements were drafted. A deal bigger than any of them would be signed in the air and sealed on the ground. Marcus watched the calendar, committed himself to a timetable he could only guess at, and waited for the moment when all disparate gears would click into place. He could have walked away. He could have let HR manage it, let the board clean its own mess. But he knew how systems defend themselves, by calling those who see them dramatic or troublemakers. People like him get dismissed as color in the background until something breaks and the room discovers a new way of imagining responsibility. And so he prepared quietly. He learned where the cleaner's keys were kept during the day. He learned which security cameras cycled on a 10-minute loop while the night guard made his rounds.
He memorized the rooftop access code to a degree that felt ridiculous when he said it aloud in the fluorescent light of the janitor's closet. He carried Sarah's photocopies in the fold of his jacket and the recorder in his sock. He did not tell Colonel Morrison everything. The colonel had told him that degrees of confidentiality are a currency in this work. Marcus's hands trembled less when he worked. The tremor stayed for the moments his brain returned to that old battlefield scale, the notion that decisions have victims and that sometimes you have to choose which scales tip. He was no avenger. He was, at that moment, a man trying to keep a life from being gambled away in a boardroom. Then, the night before the flight, something changed. David missed a meeting. Papers were shuffled urgently through the offices. A courier didn't arrive. The small, careful things that set the rhythm of corporate life began to hiccup. Marcus felt it like a pressure change in the chest. He went to the rooftop at midnight and found the helicopter under tarp, technicians' cups cold on a folding table nearby. He looked at the instrument panel through plastic and felt the shape of an abyss he did not plan to plunge into. He thought of the keys in the atrium, a toy tossed by someone who could not see the sharpness of the moment. He was not prepared for how visible he suddenly became to himself. The man who had worked silently for years realized he could make an intervention that might save a life and might ruin his own. That was the precise kind of moral crucible he had avoided in the years since his last tour. He had been attempting to live in small, honest rituals. Now those rituals demanded a scope beyond his night shift routes. That night, as rain threatened the city and the rooftop lights painted everything in a borrowed glow, Marcus arranged things the way soldiers do, not with bravado, but with the acceptance that luck can be coaxed but never guaranteed. He left a small, carefully folded note in a place he knew only a pilot or someone searching hard would find. He left a coin, an old unit coin with the Night Stalker's emblem, tucked in the cockpit's obvious place, an anchor for recognition. He left a recording in his usual way, but he did not sign it with his name. He just spoke, in measured tones, into the device, repeating questions he hoped would be jarring enough to unsettle a guilty conscience if it were played back at the right time. There is a difference between a plan and the moment it meets reality. Marcus felt both the cleanliness of intent and the grime of potential consequences. He did not imagine applause. He imagined only the hope that someone's life might be spared, and the belief that truth, if it landed in the hands of the right people, could hurt the ones who needed hurting. As dawn pulled the city from shadow, Marcus tucked himself into the familiar anonymity of night shift work and watched the building wake like a beast stretching.
He knew the flight schedule. He knew a woman would take off in a machine that might have been turned against her. He knew the ledger that hung over David's life. He knew where the lines between victim and perpetrator blurred in ways that public apologies could not fix. And somewhere in the back of his mind, under the shield of habit and training, he rehearsed how to be small when the noise came. He would not be loud. He would hope to be effective. He would wait for the wheels to lift, for the cameras to catch the last looks of those in suits, for the world to start its spin that would later be called the incident. He waited then, in the place where custodians wait, the cusp between order and chaos, broom in hand, watching life pulse through the veins of a building. The choice he had made was simple on paper and treacherous in the world. He would not let a life be traded like a point in an accounting ledger. Outside, dawn turned the black glass of the hangar into something like a mirror. Inside, in a locker that smelled of disinfectant and old cologne, Marcus folded Sarah's photocopies back into their place and pressed them flat with hands that remembered both tending to aircraft and tending to wounds. He had no illusions about the morning. He had only a stubborn belief that doing the right thing was not the same as doing the easy thing. The day began to move. Executives came and went, suits shiny and briefcases heavy with good intentions. Victoria rehearsed lines in the mirror of her office, words that would be said into cameras about innovation and leadership. David moved like a man whose ledger ached. Security made its rounds, a little brisker than usual. Marcus moved as he always had, in service and silence, except he now carried the weight of insurance clauses and whispers in his pocket. He had set his small traps for truth and survival. What he had not set for was how public the mocking would be in the atrium when she tossed those keys. When the keys slid, when Victoria's laugh cut through the room like a blade and the cameras leaned in, Marcus felt the old familiar surge. The world had a way of making some people into spectacle to distract from the engines turning beneath them. He had left his small markers on purpose in places only a pilot might see. He had left recordings in places only a patient investigator might find. He had not counted on the sting of being made a joke in the very arena where decisions would be made. He understood, with a reactive clarity, that his actions could be read as insolence by those with power. He understood they might brand him a meddler. He understood the political cost of a janitor stepping into the frame of a CEO. And still, when the keys landed against the marble and Victoria laughed, he felt a strange, unmoving resolve settle in his chest. The rest of the day blurred into a montage of small, purposeful movements.
Marcus clocked out at his usual time, walked home beneath the indifferent sky, and fed the dog he'd kept since his return from service. He slept fitfully, waking to the echo of motors in his dream. He called Colonel Morrison and gave him the barest outline. The colonel didn't ask why he'd allowed the situation to develop. The colonel only asked what he wanted done and whether he wanted backup. "I want someone to live," Marcus said, "and I want those who put them at risk to answer for it." "Then keep your head down," the colonel advised, "and let the law catch up." Marcus turned that advice over like a coin. He knew law moves in a steady, measured tempo that rarely matched the urgency of a life in the air. He knew also that the colonel's experience would be a lifeline of things tilted toward violence. Still, the man's voice on the phone was a salve. He slept for a few hours and woke to a city already forgetting night. He thought in the small clarity of dawn of all the quiet people he'd seen in the building. The security guard whose daughter was in community college, the admin who had to choose between rent and medicine, the cooks who liked to hum old Motown tunes while washing dishes. He thought of how easy it is to make jokes at their expense, to reduce them to roles. That thought had a moral horror to it. It was tolerable to joke only because someone else paid for the entertainment. He did not know that by evening the world had shifted in a way that would not be contained by polite memos. He did not know the flight would encounter the failures he had been trying to anticipate. He did not know how many cameras would catch the angle of panic in a woman's eyes, or how many voices would shout into static. He could not know whether his notes and coin and recordings would be enough. All he knew at that moment was one stubborn fact. He had refused to be merely a background figure. He had chosen to make himself present in the only way he could, by leaving a breadcrumb that might lead to a life, and by lining up, as best he could, the means for truth to surface. When the day folded into dusk and the company's lights blinked one by one, Marcus sat on a stoop and watched the world move on without regard for the truth he carried. He felt the old knot tighten, not from fear alone, but from the weight of responsibility chosen in a world that prefers not to be inconvenienced. He rose as the first rotors whispered in the distance, the city's hum answering the call of the machines. He knew the flight plan only as a calendar entry. He knew the terms of the conspiracy only as a ledger and a trembling voice. He did not know the precise details of what would happen next. None of that mattered. What mattered was that he had placed a call to conscience and had prepared to stand by the consequences. As he walked back into the building, the keys in the atrium and Victoria's laughter trailed after him like a shadow.
He tucked his recorder deeper into his sock and smoothed his uniform. The janitor, who kept the hallway spotless, stepped into his role as witness and as potential guardian. He walked with the weight of the past folded into the small courage of a man who refused to let someone else's life be bartered away without a fight. Outside the rooftop, the city's sky was clear, like a sheet stretched taut. Inside, the machines were a heartbeat away. Marcus, with his catalog of discrepancies and his folder of photocopies, moved toward the place where the world might either be saved or forever changed. He walked with the wake of the past folded into the small courage of a man who refused to let someone else's life be bartered away without a fight. Morning moved like an accusation. Press trucks assembled by the curb. Assistants in crisp coats checked earpieces and practiced statements until their mouths smelled of canned honesty. Inside, Victoria reviewed the lines that would become headlines. She smiled into a mirror like a woman practicing being solid. She had read the company's figures until they blurred. Growth projections, merger clauses, promises that sounded like sermons. To her, the helicopter was a tool, an emblem, a necessary stage prop for the kind of authority that buys silence. Marcus watched from the shadow of a loading bay, the hum of the building making a steady background. He had the folder, Sarah's photocopies, carefully folded in the inner pocket of his jacket. The coin he had left in the cockpit hummed in his memory like a lullaby. The recorder was a weight in his sock, a thing that made confessions more credible than any whispered accusation. He had not slept the night before, because sleep felt like a luxury bought by someone who had not promised a head on a ledger. By 9 a.m., things began to speed. A motorcade rolled through the plaza. Security checkpoints tightened like the fingers of people nervous about the way power can be fragile in public. Marcus moved through the underbelly of the building, through doors marked authorized personnel only, and past men with etiquette in their eyes and wariness in their belts. He kept his head down, palms warm against the mop handle he carried as if normality were an anchor. David Sterling made one more call. It was the sort of call that should have been a negotiation with a creditor, a rational attempt to buy time. Instead, it was a man drowning in small, expensive panics. "David?" Marcus had intercepted the end of the conversation near the loading dock.
He did not listen to it like gossip. He listened to it like someone tracking a pulse. "You promised me," a voice hissed. "If you can't deliver, there are consequences." David swallowed audibly. "I'm working on it. There's a flight. Then make sure it happens, or make sure it looks like an accident." The other voice was flat. David, in that thin light, sounded less a villain than a man made of paper, abandoned to the weather.
The more Marcus learned about him, the more he felt the ache that breeds such errors, a pride that refuses to admit defeat, a helplessness that moves a person to consider unspeakable bargains. Marcus didn't confront him publicly. Confrontation was a theater neither man needed. Instead, he tightened his net. He made sure the items he had left in the cockpit would be found quickly if someone searched with frantic hands. He checked from vantage points he knew well that the route down the hangar offered quick egress for emergency crews. He planted one more thing, a note in an obvious location, worded simple and human. "If you can see this, stop. Live." He did not write instructions, he wrote a plea. And then the sky called. The helicopter rose as a public promise. Victoria waved as the crowd cheered. Cameras tracked the arc of image and intention. For a moment she looked timeless, the personification of ascent. The noise of the city slurred into the mechanical whisper of rotors. Marcus watched until the machine became a dot, then a line, then a sound that throbbed at the center of his chest. Halfway through the prescribed route, everything in the machine changed, but not the way a mechanic would describe. The hum cut into stutters in people's ears. Instruments flashed like a language of birds when predators circle. Victoria's voice, caught on a dozen live channels, showed the human under the emblem, sharp breath, a laugh that curdled as adrenaline rewired her face. From below, the world heard disjointed radio and a pilot's breath, then a silence filled with the smell of ozone and the metallic taste of panic. The live feed scrambled. The cameras turned toward the river where the skyline melted, and emergency sirens started their long approach. Marcus felt the old training tense in his muscles. He did not run toward the hangar. He ran toward the place he'd planned for, Riverside Park, the likely option for a machine in trouble over the city. He was not the only one who had planned for a contingency. The colonel, older but still an unmovable presence, was already moving like an answer. He had called in a favor at the federal level, nudged an unnamed agent, and made sure the right ears were listening. Marcus had not wanted to invoke the security state without cause, but now cause had opened like a wound. The flight did not become what David or anyone had hoped. It instead became a test of people's ability to be human when the mechanic failed them. Victoria's voice on the radio was jagged, then focused. She found in the glove compartment the folded coin and the single sentence Marcus had left, the plea that refused to be instructional and asked only for composure. It was in its own way the most technical thing in that cockpit, a demand to be present. "You have to listen to me," she said into the channel, raw and childlike, and then, as if impersonating herself, she steadied. "Okay, I'm here. I'm going to try to keep control."
How she did it is not a lesson in technique. It is a story of a person discovering the private courage you only see when public masks fall away. She read the note like a liturgy. She listened to the calm voice that came from a recorder, Marcus's voice, asking not for heroics, but for patience, for small acts that preserve life. He had not told her how to fly. He had told her how to be a person in an impossible machine. Breathe, communicate, prioritize survivability, call for help. On the ground, the scene got louder. Boats in the river turned, police helicopters converged, and tens of thousands of eyes became small instruments of prayer. Marcus stood by the river's edge with the colonel at his shoulder. They watched the craft traverse a horizon that seemed to tilt with sound. Marcus felt the terror he had seen in 1,000 nights as a pilot, the sensation of momentum becoming a question. He thought about the men who had trusted him in the desert and in the dark, thought about the small ledger entries that had predicted this catastrophe. When the machine found the riverbank with a jolt that made onlookers gasp and cover their faces, it was not the cinematic impact of a crash. It was a terrible, miraculous mixture. Metal complaining, seats groaning.
the sound of woman's hands beating on a panel as if she could force metal to be more merciful. There were bodies who fell into water and into grass. There were moments of willful clarity among them. Someone pushed open a door. Someone else hauled a figure who smelled of acetone and fear into arms that did not know her name and yet held her like it did. Victoria emerged with the coin's imprint on her palm and the note damp at the edges. She coughed and cried in the same breath. She was carted over to an ambulance where a paramedic, one of the many people who volunteer for the messy business of keeping strangers alive, checked for broken things. She did not speak at first. Her hands shook in a way that made it clear. The company had been spared, but everything about her that depended on infallibility had been injured. The papers called it an incident. The cameras called it a miracle. Marcus called it an opportunity for truth. While emergency crews ferried the injured to ambulances, and 1,000 commentators argued about the optics of a billionaire being humbled, the colonel and agents from a federal office moved through the wreckage like weather. They had what Marcus had put together: recordings, photocopies, a voice that had been brave enough to confess. They also had something they'd been handed without too much fanfare: Robert Blackwood's document, the one Sarah had trusted Marcus with. It turned out Robert had been more strategic and more merciful than the executives had guessed. The unsigned directive had been simple and powerful. Robert had, in a quiet moment of foresight, put Marcus on the company payroll in a way that was not ornamental.
There was a clause, a back-channel note, that indicated Robert had seen Marcus as more than a janitor, someone whose experience and presence might be necessary one day. He had arranged a measure of protection, a retainer in the legal sense, a plan to shield a man who had served his country from slipping into the kind of invisibility that ends badly. To the agents, this looked like a man's conscience turned into legal architecture. To Victoria, who learned this in the sterile light of an examination room, it felt like betrayal. Someone her father had protected was a reminder of what she had inherited beyond a ledger: responsibility. The legal engines cranked. Someone found the voicemail David left for an enforcer, one of the edges of a conversation he had thought was private. Marcus's recorder had, in a quiet corner of the building, captured parts of David's panic-laced admissions. The federal agents, with warrants signed and authority in their pockets, played the tapes in an evidence room. David listened to himself sound like a man perhaps surprised at his own capacity for compromise. "You said it yourself," the lead agent told him gently but without mercy. "You planned to arrange an incident to trigger a payout that would ease your debts. Who were you working with?" David's face was a map of bad counsels. He named names with the kind of flat voice that people use when they count bills. The mention of the Torino family, the ledgers, the veiled threats, these were the sorts of things that sunlight dissolves. Agents had enough to secure a warrant, and the warrant led to phones, to wire transfers, to a paltry series of bribes disguised as consulting fees. It led eventually to a man who had made a life of collecting due and who had lied to himself about the moral cost. From a legal perspective, the path forward was tidy: arrests, indictments, a public trial. But humanly, the moment needed more than law. It needed truth and accountability coupled with repair. Victoria faced both in a way that would mark the rest of her tenure. The cameras did not give her the gift of privacy when she learned the extent of David's culpability and the role of her own board in permitting certain kinds of risk to flourish. Her face, once practiced, showed cracks. She could have issued a statement that blamed infrastructure or the frailty of machines. Instead, she did something rarer. She listened. She listened to Marcus speak to the press in a way that did not sensationalize him. He did not seek the cameras. He accepted a microphone because the colonel insisted, and because Sarah told him to let truth have a public voice. Marcus did not use the platform to gloat. He described in plain language the shame of being a thing to joke about, and the duty he felt when he could see a life at risk. He described his veterans group in quiet phrases, and the way service had taught him to notice patterns others ignored.
He did not present himself as a saint. He presented himself as a man who chose inconvenience over silence. Victoria heard that in the way people hear truths that cut to the bone. She called a meeting of the board, but not to craft a statement. She called a meeting to ask questions she had never asked before, not about reputation, but about policy. What did we owe him? She asked publicly in a forum that was broadcast to the city's morning shows. How did we allow people in our building to be made invisible? How many more of our colleagues are playing parts while we ignore their lives? The answers were not immediate. That afternoon, she walked into the custodial closet where Marcus had once taken his breaks
and sat on a crate he had used to store cleaning supplies. It was a place the executives rarely saw. Marcus, with his jacket still smelling of bleach and his sock full of recorder, felt the awkwardness of a private moment becoming a public turning point. "You didn't have to do it," she said, voice low. "You put yourself at risk." "It didn't feel like a choice when I saw the ledger," he replied. "It felt like a responsibility." They did not fall into easy reconciliation. There was too much to account for. But there was a beginning. Victoria's private apology, shaky and human. She asked questions about the men she had joked about. She asked how to make the company a place that saw its people. Marcus, after decades of being overlooked, found something like leverage in her contrition. Legal consequences were swift for some, slower for others. David Sterling accepted a plea that acknowledged his role in attempting to manipulate insurance and in placing the company at risk. His sentence did not absolve him. It gave him a path through accountability, and, this being a nuance often lost in headlines, an offer of treatment and restitution as part of his plea bargain. The Torino family members named in the wire transfers and ledgers were indicted and later found guilty on charges related to extortion and conspiracy. The news cycles fed off the drama for weeks, then moved on, but the measure of justice was not the headlines. It was in the hearings, the depositions, the quiet release of funds to families affected by the orchestrated risk. Robert Blackwood's papers, once the property of an executor, became something else, the physical evidence of a man's attempt to correct an injustice he perceived before he died. Those papers gave the federal agents the authority to dig deeper into insurance arrangements and to question board members on oversight failures. They also gave Marcus a strange kind of vindication, an acknowledgement that someone who had once owned the company saw him not as a fixture, but as a person to be protected. Contractually, SkyCorp Tech could not erase the mockery of the atrium, but it could change how it paid its custodial staff.
The board voted on immediate compensation increases for service workers, retroactive benefits, and an overhaul of whistleblower protections. Security protocols were revised to give employees who raised red flags a direct line to independent investigation rather than to internal PR. The company created an anonymous reporting hotline that funneled to a third-party investigator. These were small things compared to a life nearly lost, but they were institutional shifts that honored the premise. The people who keep the lights on deserve to be seen. Victoria's growth was not cinematic. It was a series of decisions that required patience and humility. She met with Sarah in the quiet of her office and asked how her father had seen the world. She sat with the janitors and listened beyond the rehearsed answers. She instituted a veterans liaison role and put Marcus in a position that both acknowledged his past and leveraged his experience for structural change. He was offered reinstatement to flight status, an honor and a temptation, but he turned it down. "I don't want the seat," he told Victoria in the boardroom when she offered it. "I want the people who sit in the back to be safe." Instead, Marcus accepted a role he considered more valuable, director of a new veteran reintegration and flight safety program. It was a hybrid position, part human resources, part field training, part policy watchdog. He would not fly for business anymore, but he would use his knowledge to prevent tragedies, to advise on procedures, and to help veterans translate military skills into civilian work. He would make sure the people who fix and fly the machines received respect and robust oversight. He would ensure that counselors were on retainer and that medication access and therapy were part of employee benefits in a real, funded way. Sarah's role shifted too. She became an advocate within HR for transparency. She helped create a safe channel process for those like David to report their coercion before it metastasized. The colonel, who had pulled strings and kept Marcus from having to craft his own defense, helped set up a liaison with the Department of Veterans Affairs in the company, ensuring that Marcus's new program would be properly staffed and funded. Marcus's men did not transform overnight. He led meetings that were small at first, coffee in the break room, a handful of veterans who showed up because someone had told them a soldier could help them speak to employers. They met in a converted office with a whiteboard and a donated coffee machine. There were awkward silences and bad jokes. There were stories about nights that still live like weather. Marcus listened and taught the rules he had believed in. Notice, document, protect. When they practiced scenarios, it was not about heroics. It was about being a community that kept each other from being lost.
Victoria did something that surprised the public and embarrassed some board members. The company launched a foundation in Robert's name, but reimagined. The Blackwood Foundation for Service and Safety committed funds to veteran transition programs, to community colleges offering aviation-related certifications, and to support services for low-wage employees facing medical crises. It was not charity with a photograph. It was a structural reallocation of priorities. Victoria pledged stock options for employees in certain tiers and made a visible case for dignity at work. She made it clear she would no longer tolerate jokes that turned people into props. There were press appearances, apologies filmed on polished sets, and interviews that tried to parse sincerity from survival. Critics said the company acted under pressure.
Others said the reforms were long overdue. Victoria accepted the criticism. She met with the families who had been affected by corporate negligence, sat with them and listened. She commissioned an independent audit on risk management and promised to publish it. Those were words, but they were backed by audits and new hires, independent safety officers with real authority. Marcus found in time that public speaking did not terrify him so much as it used to. He taught courses for SkyCorp Tech on noticing anomalies, on how companies can build cultures that do not permit people to be invisible, on the mechanics of humane oversight. He trained technicians to respect reporting lines and to value human testimony. He helped write a section of policy that made it harder for any CFO to quietly move funds without independent review. There was resistance. There always is. Some executives grumbled about red tape. Some investors called the measures too costly. But something else changed as well. The custodial staff got new uniforms that were not meant to be invisible. They got a new voice in the company's governance. The breakers in the old hierarchy were not dramatic coups. They were a series of small measures that added up, shifted company culture like sediment changing a riverbed. Months after the incident, the courtroom drama moved forward. David pled guilty. His sentence included fines, community service, and a school of restitution programs meant to deter others from making the same choices. The Torino family members received sentences that matched their crimes. The court did not turn them into mythic villains, but prosecuted them for the ledger crimes they had committed. The publicity served as deterrent and a cautious form of catharsis. For Marcus and for Victoria, accountability had to be more than a spectacle. They insisted on names being called and processes reformed, not simply people being shamed. In private, there were harder reckonings. Victoria faced her board in a non-broadcast meeting and asked hard questions about the culture the company had created, about how privilege had been weaponized into entertainment.
She apologized at length to staff and to a camera that would broadcast the words. There was an honest moment when she told Marcus she had laughed because she had not seen him as a person. The admission cut the air like a blade. Marcus did not accept it as absolution. He accepted it as a beginning. The work after the headlines was prosaic. Marcus ran programs. He met with veterans who had trouble translating military abbreviations into civilian resumes. He helped an ex-mechanic reconnect with his trade after a stint in a VA hospital. He served on the board that revised safety oversight. He taught a class for mid-level managers on the ethics of power, how to avoid turning the people they employ into props for a corporate narrative. His presence was a small roving correction in a company that had once seen him as scenery. There was also a personal cost. The anonymous slashes, the photograph in his locker, those had left prints on his sleep. He had taken to therapy again, as he had promised himself years before. The colonel called sometimes, and he and Marcus would talk about nights in dusty places and about how the world could feel like a place with too many small, dangerous bargains. Marcus did not pretend that the reforms healed everything. He said, with a kind of sober gratitude, that living with purpose had helped him find peace in a way no news cycle could narrate. One afternoon, a year after the flight, the company held a small ceremony near the atrium. It was not the public roast of the earlier festivities. It was a memorial of sorts, a plaque honoring those who work unseen, and a new scholarship for veterans seeking aviation careers. Victoria stood at a podium and read, from a hand that trembled with responsibility, the list of reforms the company had made. She did not ask for applause. She asked for a promise. "We will look for the human in the background," she said, "and when we find them, we will make sure they are not invisible." Marcus stood near the back, hands in his pockets. He was invited to speak. He had resisted public attention from the start, but he understood the value of telling a different story. When he took the microphone, the room went quiet. "You think being a janitor teaches you nothing," he began, voice steady. "You think cleaning up means you clean up other people's messes. But the truth is, when you clean hallways, you learn how rooms are made. You learn the seams. You learn where things break." He talked about the men he had flown with. He talked about therapy and medication and therapy again. He talked about the small measures that keep people alive. A shoulder, a question asked twice, a folder tucked into a sock. He did not make it about himself. He made it about attention. "See the human," he said at the end, and the phrase stuck like glue. It became less a slogan than a way of living. People repeated it in quiet ways. A manager would walk past a janitor and ask about his day.
A veteran would say yes to a training because it wasn't tucked behind a gate. The small habit of seeing people rippled. Victoria stayed in the company, but in a different posture. She learned to listen, not to perform. She went to the flight program Marcus ran and sat in the back, learning names, learning histories.
She worked with the board when they argued about costs and reminded them of the day she felt what it was to be fallible. She insisted that the foundation be more than a PR wrapper. It funded programs that actually transformed lives. She made mistakes. She apologized. She was not a saint. She was a leader learning what leadership costs. Marcus did not become a public celebrity. He did not want that. He said yes to a narrower kind of visibility, a place in the company where he could push policy, mentor veterans, and ensure that the oversight mechanisms that were missing the day of the incident would never be missing again. He taught technicians and managers the same lesson he had learned in the field. Notice the minor variations. Do not let pride blind you to risk. When you see a problem, document it and call for help. Sometimes, late in the evening, he would walk through the atrium and catch sight of the spot where his knees had felt that sudden sting of humiliation. The architecture of the building had not changed much, but the way people moved through it had. The custodial staff no longer joked about the CEO's shoes. The security guards ate lunch with the admin staff sometimes. Small things ripple. The final legal settlement included not only restitution and criminal penalties were appropriate, but also an agreement from SkyCorp Tech to create a permanent oversight committee that included rank-and-file employees. The committee had a seat for someone from maintenance, someone from HR, someone from veterans advocacy, and an independent safety officer. That governance shift made the company less nimble in the predatory sense, but more humane. Years later, at a panel for corporate ethics, Victoria would tell the story of the keys and the laughter. She would not tell it to titillate. She would tell it as a cautionary tale about the danger of turning people into props. She would speak of duty. Marcus would sit on the stage and answer a question about how to prevent similar tragedies. He would talk about attention, about the humility to believe that a person with a broom might also hold a ledger of truth. The city noticed the small changes. Other companies followed suit in varying degrees. The mimetic phrase, "see the human," found its way into HR memos in other buildings. Of course, not everything changed. People could still be cruel, systems still had gaps, but in one mid-level $2 billion firm, the tide bent. On a cool spring morning, a small group of veterans came back to the hangar where Marcus had once left his coin in the fold of a uniform. They were not the heroic, cinematic figures of movies.
They were teachers, mechanics, students, fathers and mothers, learning again to hold a life that had escaped them for years. Marcus watched them learn to translate their military skills into certificates and resumes. He taught them how to speak to a corporate HR manager who once would have been dismissive. He taught them, again, to notice. He taught them to write down dates and faces, and now to be brave in small ways. At the center of the training room, there was a case with service emblems, some donated and some worn thin. On the wall hung the coin Marcus had given Victoria that one night, now framed behind glass, but not as a token of heroism. It was labeled, a reminder. Below it was the plaque that read, simply, "See the human." On the anniversary of the incident, the company held a small gathering in the atrium. Victoria and Marcus stood together, not because the world demanded a contrived redemption photo, but because both had learned the hard way that responsibility is less theatrical and more painstaking. Victoria had matured into a person who accepted accountability as a daily task, not a PR stunt. Marcus had become a man who had learned to trust institutions enough to try to change them from the inside. At the podium, Marcus told a story about the sound of rotors. He did not describe how to save a plane. He described what it feels like to be human under pressure, the rise of fear, the clarity of small kindnesses, the way strangers can become the only lifeline you have. He spoke of his veterans and of the people who had shown up for them. He spoke of the criminal and of Sarah, and of the man who had once trusted him with protective paperwork. "People think courage is dramatic," he said, "but sometimes courage is being present when someone else is invisible. That's where we start." When the ceremony ended and the crowd thinned, the two of them lingered by the fountain where the keys had once slid. The marble was polished. The echo of laughter that had once shamed him now felt like a thing that could be transmuted, if not into absolution, then into responsibility. Victoria looked at him, and this time the look was not predatory. It was reflective. "Thank you," she said, small and honest. Marcus shrugged, as if shrugging could carry years. "I did what I had to." They did not embrace. They did not need the theatrics. The work, after all, was ongoing. As the sun set on another long day, Marcus walked home past the shops and the people who had no idea the part he had played in remaking a corporate culture. He passed a diner where a veteran he had helped now waited to meet his daughter for the first time after a long estrangement. He paused a moment longer than habit and watched them hug. It was not the end, but it was one measurable kind of repair.
If you want to learn more about veteran resources and the programs that can help people transition from service to civilian life, check the link in the description for vetted organizations and the documentary that follows this story. Share this with someone who needs to hear that. People matter, especially those who clean the floors we walk on. See the human.